Welcome, awesome EarthKind people. New York State has one of the most aggressive climate laws in the country. The 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or CLCPA, mandates that New York achieve carbon emissions of 40% by 2030, less than 9 years from now, and 85% by 2050. Achieving these ambitious goals will mean transforming the way we generate and use electricity, the way we heat and cool our homes, and the way we get to school and work. While clean electricity is a key component to achieving these goals, getting our cars and trucks off of fossil fuels is even more important, which is why New York is now also eliminating the sale of all gas vehicles by 2035. But the additional reality is that our homes and buildings are an equal source of greenhouse gas emissions. We cannot hit our carbon reduction goals without moving away from fossil fuels for our heating, cooling, and hot water. But what are the best clean heating solutions? And how do we make it happen while reducing energy costs, creating quality jobs, and ensuring environmental justice? In this week's Awesome EarthKind podcast, we meet with Bill Nowak. Bill is the executive director of New York-GEO, the Geothermal Heating and Cooling Association that brings together manufacturers, installers, environmentalists, and concerned citizens to promote the most efficient heating and cooling source on the planet, geothermal energy, using the power of the earth. Bill shares his insights into how geothermal heating and cooling is the most effective means of reducing the carbon emissions from our homes and other buildings, and what government policies we need to change to achieve these critically important goals. Today's podcast is being sponsored by the Power of Earth with Comfort by Climate Master. Climate Master is a 50-year-old United States manufacturer of geothermal heating, cooling, and hot water systems. Download a free web class to discover how easy it is to get ultra-efficient geothermal heating and cooling installed in your home or building without the pain of emptying your savings account. Watch one of the Power of Earth with Comfort web classes from Climate Master off of the Awesome EarthKind website. You'll discover the answers every homeowner needs to know, including how geothermal heating and cooling can draw energy from the ground beneath our feet for pennies, why building owners everywhere are making the switch, the secrets to securing utility incentives and tax credits to pay for a large portion of the new geothermal system, and much, much more. If you're tired of rising energy costs and want to save up to 70% of your energy bills and make a positive environmental impact, go to www.awesomeearthkind.com and download one of the free special events that will show you exactly how to get geothermal heating and cooling installed in your home or building. And at the conclusion of today's podcast, find out what you can do to multiply your climate impact by a factor of 1,000. Now, let's hear Bill Nowak share his insights into geothermal heating and cooling and the policy changes that can make it all possible. And energize. Welcome to the Awesome EarthKind podcast. If you would please let folks know who you are, where do you work, what do you do?
Hey, Ron. I'm Bill Nowak. I'm the executive director of the New York Geothermal Energy Organization. And we're an organization that's been around since 2014. We represent stakeholders in the geothermal heat pump industry. So installers, distributors, manufacturers, advocates, folks who work these programs up in the community and let folks know about it. So it's been a great organization to work for at a really inspiring time. I mean, this is when we either put the limits on climate change or not. and geothermal has a really important role to play in that respect. And I'm just privileged to be part of hopefully making that happen.
Yeah, you've done an incredible job, Bill, and I'm looking forward to diving into a whole bunch of things with you on this subject, because it's about heating and cooling and hot water, about a third of the greenhouse gases that we produce from our buildings. So really looking forward, and done an incredible job setting up New York Geo. So, all right, well, we like to start with, we call it a quantum quote, kind of a quote, an inspirational quote that helps frame the conversation. You have one you'd care to share, sir?
We need to put a sunset on fossil fuel use in our homes. It's that simple. I'm hopefully gonna get a chance to show you a chart as we talk, showing that at this point, heating our homes is tied. It's co-equal with transportation. People think, electricity generation is the be all and end all of climate change, and we've got to get away from fossil fuels there. It's absolutely true that we need to do that. But the main forces in New York State at this point that are contributing greenhouse gases are heating buildings and driving. And we have to take care of both of those. We've got a limit that was just signed by the governor of 2035 for fossil fuel vehicles. We need the same thing in place for fossil fuel heating systems. There is at this point a proposal in front of the Climate Action Council to stop in new construction using fossil fuels for heating and hot water and cooking and clothes drying and so forth. And we need to have that in place as soon as possible, because every time a new building goes up that uses fossil fuels, we're locking ourselves into continued climate change, increasing climate change for another 20 to 30 years. And we need to stop that now, and we need to start making the transition for all our buildings.
Outstanding. Great. Sunset on fossil fuels, especially in new construction. Love it. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. All right. Yep. We like to also frame the conversation with why. Why are you doing this, Bill?
I'm doing it for everybody who comes after me. I and friends of mine are currently seeing some of the horrors that await us with climate change. It is going to be about suffering, human beings suffering. And the head of New York or California GEO is currently a few miles outside of the Dixie Fire and has been evacuated from his home and is seeing destruction all around him. He's seeing air that is filled with smoke and just unbreathable. And this is what awaits so much of humanity at this point. So the why for me is making that as little as possible. We know we're facing a lot of that. We could be facing an overwhelming amount of that for all of us. So really trying to lessen the amount of suffering that humanity is facing is the why for me.
Excellent. Yeah, no doubt. And there's over 60 wildfires going right now. And then that's over in the West. And in the East, we've got floods and tornadoes and hurricanes and all sorts of
people drowning in their basements.
Unbelievable, right?
In their basement apartments. It's just awful.
Yeah. Yeah. Did a show last week, and the picture for the show was a tornado in New Jersey. Just an average everyday occurrence, right? Just like we grew up. So
yeah, every 100 years. No, it's every 10 years now, or every year that we're facing these kind of things. And
yes, indeed.
We just, we don't have enough social cohesion at this point to withstand that. It really takes a unified society to rebound from that kind of stuff. And it creates divisions, having those kind of problems and having people needing to pull together to rebuild communities. We're just going to have to rebuild community after community, and it's going to tear us apart as people compete for those resources.
Yeah, really incredible.
Don't want to be a Debbie Downer here, Ron. I know you run an optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, on the negative side, there's no doubt. I mean, 2020 was the largest year of $1 billion events, of over 22 $1 billion weather catastrophes, and this last one with Hurricane Ida was a $50 billion one, and they just keep getting bigger and more intense. And that's exactly what the scientists have predicted: is, look, we're going to get more intense, more frequent, and it's going to cost us more and more in both financial dollars, which is, already becoming a stretch, but then in terms of human lives and suffering. And your point is very well taken, Bill. So yeah, it's you're in a noble place to be. So, all right, let's talk about these geothermal. Let's talk about these geothermal technologies and how they work and why you see such great promise, and what sort of things are you working to get done that will have an impact besides the limit on fossil fuels, which I absolutely agree on, but other things as well. So go ahead.
Yeah. Geothermal is just an incredible resource. People think about solar energy, and this is one of the finest examples of solar energy we have. A lot of people, geothermal is a confusing term for people because it applies to a couple different forms of heat, one of which is from deep inside the earth. That's not what we're tapping with geothermal heating and cooling. We are tapping primarily and almost exclusively solar energy that's deposited and absorbed by the Earth's crust. And it's just this limitless resource that's out there. And once we have it tapped, once we get through that initial cost of drilling or excavating the Earth and accessing that resource, it's going to be an endless source of heat and an endless sink of heat for cooling in the summer. The first crisis we're going to be facing in a lot of cases is going to be about heat and summer heat waves and the kind of suffering that happens with that. We're going to need to be doing a lot of cooling. We need to do it in the most efficient way possible. And geothermal is it. It's just very, very efficient. You're tapping in to the heat and the cooling capacity of the Earth, which is there for free. It's our yards, our a power plant for that kind of energy.
Yeah, it's great. So we have a whole series of podcasts and webinars, folks, called the Power of Earth series, where we talk about how if you just go down 4 or 5 feet, the Earth for billions of years has been absorbing about half the energy from the sun, and 4 or 5 feet down, it's that constant temperature of 50, 55 degrees. And when you do that, you send the fluid down, you bring that temperature back, you have now 50, 55 degrees that you're starting with. And as Bill's saying, it's the most efficient form of heating and cooling. Every unit of energy you put into a geothermal system, you get 4 to 5 units of heating and cooling out of it. And it's a constant temperature all year round. No matter what's happening outside, you're starting with 50, 55 degrees. And it's just fantastic. So in New York and elsewise, how do you see the trends? What's happening and what needs to happen besides this ban on fossil fuels? But what do you see is happening, and what are the great signs of hope, and where do you think that we need to next put our efforts and focus, Bill?
Well, New York State has a leading piece of legislation, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and that is a legal mandate for the state to get to a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030 and an 85% reduction by 2050. So we are in a state of motion in this state right now, attempting to meet those goals. There is a body called the Climate Action Council, which is a body of about 22 folks, many of whom are the leading authorities in New York State government who are tasked with putting this together. And then there are also folks from industry and from the environmental side that are part of that body. And they have set up 7 advisory panels that came up with plans for various sectors in the economy. I sat on the Energy Efficiency and Housing Advisory Panel, and we put forth a series of recommendations, including the sunsetting of fossil fuels and many measures to make sure that our disadvantaged communities from throughout New York see a large percentage of the benefits. There's going to be enormous job creation. There's going to be enormous economic activity that happens as we make this transition. And we need to keep that as close to the grassroots and as beneficial for New Yorkers as possible. And that's one of the great things about geothermal. You look at some technologies and maybe they're manufactured, in China or someplace, and a lot of the economic benefit goes out of the country, out of the state. With geothermal, when you're drilling, when you're excavating, when you're creating the ground loops, that's something that has to happen right at home. And the main manufacturers of geothermal heat pumps are US companies at this point. It's Water Furnace, Climate Master, Enertech. These are all great American companies that are creating jobs here. And there's going to be a lot of jobs created in moving this forward. So that's a very positive trend. I think we're seeing a good deal of effort in New York State. They have set up, in NYSERDA, they have set up clean heating communities, which are employing local people to kind of get the word out in local communities. And our installers and drillers at this point are very busy installing geothermal heat pumps throughout New York State.
Fantastic. So what do you think are the biggest obstacles? I mean, what are you seeing that really needs to be overcome that's a challenge?
Yeah. The thing about geothermal is there is an upfront cost. You go for a gas furnace and you pay a certain amount of money, but the other utility ratepayers are paying to get the pipes to you. People don't realize, they think it's free and it just happens kind of out of the blue. But we are paying, millions and millions of dollars as utility ratepayers to extend gas lines to people's homes, and they don't see that cost. Whereas for a geothermal system currently at this point, that's left up to the individual homeowner to take. So there are incentives that are being put in place. There are financing mechanisms that are being put in place. But the fact of the matter is, when you do this, you need to look at the upfront cost. We've got the same thing with solar. I've got solar panels on my house, and New York State has made it very easy. There's a federal tax credit. There is a state tax exemption for sales tax. There's a state rebate, and there are also a state tax credit. So geothermal needs to get parity in relation to solar. The solar on my house has worked out very well. We have saved money from day one. We need to make that same kind of situation be there for renewable heating. And to get there, we need a state tax credit, which we don't have yet for geothermal. We need a state sales tax exemption, which we don't have yet. There are rebates on a state level. There are tax credits on a federal level. So we need those, half of the elements we're there for, and we need the other two to get there for parity.
Okay, so biggest challenge, upfront cost. Two few different ways of doing it. One, people should know that there is a federal tax credit of 26% that's available, and there is a state utility incentives that come in terms of the cash write down. But the state also should really put in place a sales tax exemption and a sales tax credit that deals with the individual homeowners that are there. And then one of the things you touched on was this whole concept that last century we set up and allowed utilities to invest in natural gas infrastructure, right? And then they basically decided that, oh, okay, well, when somebody needs to hook into this gas infrastructure, we'll run the lines to their house for free, and then they just have to pay for the inside stuff. So do you see something similar with geothermal where that could happen, where you put in place some kind of network of community geothermal wells that might make sense in certain areas?
Well, yeah, there's a couple ways of getting to the upfront costs. Actually, three ways, one of which is setting up the incentives so that they cover as much of that as possible. And as I mentioned, it made it happen for solar. On my house, there's so little left to pay off on the initial build that I'm able to do it over 15 years and save money in the process. The second way is by third-party ownership. And this is happening throughout the country. There are webinars on this all the time, where there is someone who comes and sets up the loop and owns the loop and charges the homeowner or the building owner on a monthly basis for the heat that's delivered, and that's how the infrastructure is paid off. And that can happen from a number of different sources. It can happen from private sources. It could also happen from utility companies. That's one of the things they're looking at, particularly in Massachusetts, but also New York has recently set up a whole offering where about 20 different places across the state, they're doing either feasibility studies or actually some construction to make this happen. And then the third way is to have a district system. And a district system would be where you set up pipes that really serve a number of different buildings at the same time. And this can be beneficial, particularly when you've got buildings like commercial buildings or supermarkets that are really using cooling a lot more than heating much of the time. And regular residential buildings that may be using heating more of the time. And you can use some of the heat energy to supply the heat energy that's taken off the buildings that are cooling to supply the buildings that need heating. This is something that is being experimented with at this point. We're hopeful that it's going to turn out to be a net positive in terms of the costs, and it has been demonstrated to do that in some circumstances, like the Skidmore College campus and other places where it's currently in place. You've got a lot of buildings on a campus that need cooling. They've got a lot of computers running, and they put off that excess heat, and then it's absorbed in the dorms, for example. We need to be careful with this. You can see with the utilities, yes, it's free to the individual homeowner, but people are constantly complaining about the high cost of utilities. So we need to make sure that as we try some of these district systems, that we do it in the most efficient way possible. We know that where there's competition in the marketplace, when there's a lot of smaller players who really know how to do things right, they can do things very efficiently and at the lowest cost possible. When you start adding, a bureaucracy with a lot of kind of different rules and different, there's efficiencies that are built into doing things large scale, and there are also inefficiencies oftentimes that come with that. So it's something that we're watching carefully and we're hopeful about. We applaud NYSERDA for getting into that and setting up a bunch of different examples across the state. And we're looking to see how we can help them to make that a success.
Excellent. So as you see this going forward, it sounds like there's both an individual homeowner piece for the millions of homes that are single family residents, but then there's also a neighborhood piece for those communities that are relatively close together, where they can have district or neighborhood systems. And then how about in larger buildings, multi-story, multifamily buildings?
Yeah, we haven't seen the limit on that yet. There's a company, and I'm blanking on it, in Toronto that has done a number of high rises there. We have the example of St. Patrick's Cathedral, of a really large building in New York City. There are great multifamily examples going up at this point in Queens, in the Hudson Valley, where dozens and dozens of units are being done with geothermal in a very efficient manner. There's even several buildings going up where the loops go in, they're drilled underneath the building. So you don't need a big footprint, particularly for a new build. So there is not a limit at this point on what geothermal can do.
Yeah, your points are well. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, there was a study done fairly early on in New York City, and of the million-some buildings there, they saw the potential in at least 800,000 of them to be able to use geothermal.
Wow. Yeah, I always point to St. Patrick's Cathedral because it's a world-renowned, icon. And the fact that it's St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan, the least expensive source of improving their heating and cooling system when they needed to replace it was geothermal. Drilling 2,000 feet under St. Patrick's in Manhattan was more cost-effective than any other alternative. And it was a 30% reduction in energy, which is just fantastic and amazing. And there's example after example now of multifamily buildings that are putting in solar with geothermal and winding up reducing costs, having air conditioning at $10 a month per apartment, where normally it would be $100 a month in the peak summer times, and winter costs that are cheaper than natural gas, if you could believe such a thing, and affordable housing. So left and right. And yeah, those examples of the fact that you can drill in New York down 500 feet. That's the sort of, I think that's one of the limits right now. And until you have to get additional permits, and 500 feet under any building will carry the heating, cooling, and hot water up to 30 stories, 25 or 30 stories, which is just astonishing because most buildings are less than 25 or 30 stories, right? And then what about this drilling law? Is that something that needs to be changed, that you can go down more than 500 feet, Bill?
Well, yeah, there is, the drilling laws have been set up around drilling for fossil fuels and drilling for water. And geothermal is different. Most of the time, when we drill a hole, we call it a borehole as opposed to a well, because we're not trying to bring up water from underneath the ground in most cases. In most cases, we're running water through a pipe, and it doesn't come into any contact. The water doesn't. The water is limited by the pipe, doesn't come into any contact with the earth around it. So there is, at this point, regulations that were set up for fossil fuels, where you're dealing with a situation where fossil fuels might be escaping into the atmosphere, or water where you don't want to mess with an aquifer. And that limit is 500 feet. Things become a lot more difficult when you drill to 500 feet. Permits are needed with the Department of Environmental Conservation. And we've been having some very good discussions with them about what needs to change in the laws and the regulations to make that fair and protective and good for the environment to be doing it more than 500 feet. We're hopeful that that's going to have some good results and make it easier on geothermal installations.
Yeah, so right now, 500 feet under the footprint of any building, heat, hot water, and cooling up to 25 or 30 stories. Once we get beyond this and we get out of this expensive permitting piece, going down further means you can build up higher. So outstanding. All right.
Yeah.
So
Ron, how long is this interview? Can I ask you?
It's about 25 or 30 minutes. So we're maybe a little bit longer, depending upon how long you want to go. And if you want to go into the extended piece, would you like to do that or no?
Well, there were a couple more points I wanted to make. And,
please do.
Okay. One of them is unfair electric rates for geothermal. At this point, this is a problem we really need to solve, because the operating, you're dealing, when you do a change in your utility system, you need, you have the upfront costs, and then you have the operating costs, the average bill that you get. And at this point, geothermal customers are being overcharged. NYSERDA did a study that came out a couple years ago and showed that being anywhere from $400 to $800 a year for consumers. And what this is about is, when a utility faces costs, at this point in New York State, the utility companies just pass along the cost of the electricity. They get it from a private company and they pass it along. What they are mainly charging you for is what it costs them to deliver the energy to you. And that's based on how high capacity the wires have to be, how much distribution hardware they need to install. And because geothermal is so efficient on the hottest and coldest days of the year, when the systems are being stressed, we're really a benefit to the grid. And that is not recognized at this point in the rates. It's recognized by NYSERDA in that study. It's recognized by Central Hudson, which has something called a geothermal rate impact credit. But in general, it's not recognized in the rates. And we're pushing to make that happen. And when that does happen, geothermal is already much less expensive than oil and propane to operate. It's generally about even with natural gas in most circumstances at this point. When we get the right delivery rates from the utilities and from the Public Service Commission, it's going to make it just that much more obvious that this is a solution going forward, and that it's something that people are going to need and want to do.
All right, so changing the electric rates to make them more appropriate for geothermal heating and cooling systems. And did you say there was something else as well that you think needs to be changed, Bill?
Well, there is. I'd like to go back to one of the points I was raising originally. Can I share the screen? Is that something that...
You can. The folks that are listening won't be able to see it, but we'll direct them to come and watch. And those people who are watching this, which there are some, will be able to see it to begin with. So yes, please share.
Okay. All right. So I will do this and try to mainly get the point across in what I say. So we're going to start with this pie chart, which was recently presented to the Climate Action Council. And it shows, for folks that are just listening, there's a green wedge that says electricity, and that's electricity generation. It's about between 15 and 20% of the greenhouse gases that are contributed in New York State. So a relatively minor amount. We need to clean that up, but it is not one of the major factors. The two biggest parts of this pie chart that take up a quarter each of the pie chart, even more than a quarter each, are transportation and buildings. And because buildings, the electricity use is part of what happens in buildings, but that's already accounted for in the electricity sector. This is almost exclusively the heating and hot water of buildings. And you can see that they are co-equal with transportation. At this point, you consistently hear that transportation is New York's biggest problem. It is a big problem, but buildings are just as big of a problem. And a lot of the reason for that, I'm going to show a second chart that, oops, wrong direction here. This chart is another one that was recently shown to the Climate Action Council, and it shows the contribution of different fuel sources to greenhouse gas emissions and to global warming. And the one on the left shows the numbers that have been used to date, which include a 100-year time frame and don't include the emissions that happen out of state through the production of these various fuels. And they show distillate fuel, which is basically heating oil, and gasoline, being about 1.5 times as problematic as natural gas is. The column on the left or on the right shows the new figures that include the requirements of New York's climate law that includes a 20-year time frame, and natural gas or methane is much more dangerous on a 20-year time frame than it is on a 100-year time frame. It's about 86 times as bad of a climate gas than carbon dioxide is. So basically what this chart shows is that natural gas is about twice as problematic as we thought it was. And it is, when you look at the fine print, which I'm disappointed they put that down in the fine print, it is worse for the climate than heating oil. So We've been consistently getting the word that, we need to get folks off heating oil first. And it's just not the case. Gas is the problem in New York State, both for electricity generation at this point, because there is no coal generation in New York State at this point, and also for heating buildings. So, folks have to stop thinking of gas as what it's been advertised for decades and decades, which is the cleanest source of fuel and a great bridge fuel to renewables. It is neither at this point.
Wow. Incredible. So basically this study from the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, folks that are looking at all the different sources and what to do about it, pretty much documents that natural gas is not a clean fuel. And, I like to say, when we take a look at heating and cooling, any fossil fuel is always less than 100%, no matter how good you are. And when you start to look at heat pumps, you got air and ground source heat pumps. Air source heat pumps have usual efficiencies of a couple 100%, 200 to 300, depending on the time of year. That goes down when it's really hot or really cold. Whereas ground source heat pumps have efficiencies of 400 and 500%. For every unit of energy put in, you get 4 and 5 units of heating and cooling out of it all year round, no matter how hot or cold it is outside. But now what basically this documentation shows is that natural gas, which everyone thought was a really clean fuel, actually has a worse contribution than oil in terms of greenhouse gases, which is really astonishing and boy, quite disturbing. So
Yeah,
thank you so much for sharing that, Bill.
for folks who can't see and are listening, I'm pointing the pointer at this point to some fine print at the bottom, which shows that gas is basically 235 pounds for every million BTUs produced. And that is more than oil. It is more than gasoline. It's more than diesel. So it is the worst. And people need to understand that. You know, we've done some estimates using this new accounting. An average home would put maybe $500 to $700 worth of climate pollution, the way climate pollution is being valued at this point, into the air every year. $500 to $700.
Wow. So would you say that's one of the biggest lessons that you've encountered recently, Bill?
I would. I think it's really important for people to understand that, you know, so much it's all in the ads and so on and so forth. It's all about solar and wind are great. We need to get more of that. We need to get a lot more of that, but it's our own homes that are doing a lot of the damage at this point, particularly in New York State, relatively speaking. And we need to start taking responsibility for that. We need help to take responsibility for that. And we need education to take responsibility for that.
All right. Thank you so much. So many times in our lives, there's kind of this one moment, this kind of aha, where you realize something that, you know, kind of puts you on a different path. Would you have a particular insightful moment that you care to share?
I've been trying to share them all interview, Ron, but, you know, for me, it's when I woke up to what climate change is all about. And it was early. I listened to what they were saying in the late 80s, and I understood it. And there wasn't a lot of kind of built up love for fossil fuels that got in my way of that. And just realizing that we are facing enormous suffering if we don't act now. It's going to take some sacrifices to avoid suffering. Those sacrifices have to do with making change, and change is difficult for people. We really need to band together as a human race to solve this problem.
Yeah, really great point. All right, we're going to go into what we call the Pulsar Round. And this is where we're going to ask you a series of questions and look for your short, succinct, amazing, and mind-blowing answers. Are you ready? Here we go. What's the best advice you've ever received, Bill?
Do unto others as you would do unto yourself.
Ah, that's always a great one. Thank you. One of your personal habits that contributes to your success?
I think I was raised to work hard and to take other people's concerns seriously, and it works.
Outstanding. An internet resource that you'd like to share with folks?
The New York-GEO website.
And
you know, we put out a weekly newsletter called Just In, and if you're a member of New York-GEO, you get access to that every Saturday with a complete listing. If you're not a New York-GEO member, you can still access the 3 top stories from Just In each week on our website, and they're up there for a week, and then we archive it on the website as well.
Outstanding. And that website is?
NY-GEO.org.
NY-GEO.org. There we go. All right. A book you'd recommend for people, and why?
You know, I'm sorry, Ron. I read articles at this point. With my life, it's so busy, I don't get to read books. There's, you know, some great titles I've heard about, but
okay. How about what do you read, Bill, that you'd like to share? Because some people
there's a great publication on the web called Green Energy Times. There's City and State that's put out about, and it largely has to do with politics in New York State, but they also really cover well a lot of the energy stuff that happens. And there's Politico New York and New Jersey Energy. Those are 3 sources that I go to pretty regularly. So Green Energy Times is a great daily blog that comes out.
Green Energy Times. Excellent. Thank you. All right, Bill, if you had a magic wand and you could change it and you could wave it, and change one thing for everybody in the world, what would it be?
It would be a fossil fuel sunset. And starting in New York State and spreading worldwide. We need to stop burning fossil fuels.
There you go. So what's the one thing you're most energized about today, Bill?
I think the other people that are waking up and getting active. The word is getting out. There is an incredible grassroots organization called Renewable Heat Now that New York-GEO participates in. And it's just awesome to see largely young people in this organization with sophisticated analysis and great skills that they built up working to make this all happen.
Outstanding. Well, coming to the end here. So if you would share a piece of parting advice and the best way for folks to get a hold of you if you'd like them to.
My email, and I'm happy to hear from folks, is NY-GEO, no dash in that on the email, NYGEOINFO@gmail.com. So New York Geo info @gmail.com. And please get in touch. Please get involved. There's so much to do, so much to do.
Any piece of grand finale guiding advice you'd like to share?
Ron, you have been a stalwart for decades. You and I go back a long time, and you have done great work for decades. Thank you for doing this series, and thank you for the work that you've done.
Oh, thank you, Bill. You've been an icon, a joy, just a leader in this climate change, technology change, getting things moving from the political perspective through the community perspective for, boy, as long as I've known you. And it's a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show. And thank you so much. Anything that you wanted to touch on that we missed?
I think we got it. We need to get the electric rates right. We need to get a fossil fuel sunset. We need to get resources to disadvantaged communities, and we need to make it happen now.
Outstanding. Bill Nowak, New York Geo, ny-geo.org. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on the show. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us today, awesome EarthKind people. Do you want to increase your climate impact by a factor of 1,000? Then pick up your phone today and call your United States congressional representative and both your U.S. senators and ask them to support the federal Build Back Better bill. Build Back Better will create the largest climate protection action in American history. Because so few people take the time and make the effort, our elected representatives interpret the opinion of everyone who calls or writes as representing the views of 1,000 other citizens. During the week of September 27th, Congress will vote on the Build Back Better bill that aims to get our country to 80% pollution-free electricity by 2030 and cut climate pollution 100% by 2050. The Build Back Better bill provides tax incentives for solar, wind, energy efficiency, electric cars, charging stations, and more. And it will finally cut the subsidies for fossil fuels. It will also drive major investments into communities that have been disproportionately hit by environmental injustice. When you make the calls, spread the word via social media by posting images of a large red exclamation point using the hashtags Code Red Climate and Code Red Congress. You'll be joining some of your favorite musicians and celebrities, including the Dave Matthews Band, Dead and Companies, Billie Eilish, Melissa Eldridge, Phineas, Maroon 5, Brittany Howard, John Baptiste, Alex Benjamin, Leonardo DiCaprio, Jane Fonda, Mark Ruffalo, Damien and Stephen Marley, Group Love, Huey Lewis and the News, and many more. When the Build Back Better bill passes, the United States can enter the global climate negotiations on November 1st, with America setting out to cut climate pollution 100% by 2050 and be able to encourage other nations to do the same. If not you, then who? The time is now. Act now. Pick up the phone. Call your congressional representatives and U.S. senators and help create a better future for our children and all the 7 billion EarthKind people on the planet. Thank you.